The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Oakwood's perfect lawns. Diane Reynolds stood at her living room window, coffee mug in hand, watching the street with the same attention she'd given it for the past 15 years. The neighborhood had changed little in that time, the same well-kept houses, manicured gardens, and familiar faces. Diane knew everyone who belonged and, more importantly to her, who didn't. Her position as Neighborhood Watch Coordinator wasn't just a title to her. It was a responsibility she took seriously, perhaps too seriously according to her husband. "You're not a security guard, Diane," he'd often say with a sigh before returning to his newspaper. But Diane felt a duty to keep Oakwood safe, to preserve the peace and quiet they all paid such high property taxes to enjoy. The boy walking down her street caught her attention immediately. He couldn't have been more than 12, with dark skin and a bright blue t-shirt that stood out against the tree-lined backdrop. What made Diane's eyes narrow wasn't his appearance but his behavior. He moved slowly, stopping occasionally to look at houses, sometimes pulling out what appeared to be a phone to take pictures. His backpack seemed stuffed full, bulging at the seams. "That's odd," she whispered to herself, setting down her coffee. In 15 years, she'd memorized which families had children and what those children looked like. This boy wasn't from Oakwood, she was certain of it. She watched him pause in front of the Henderson place, seemingly admiring the Victorian architecture. Then he checked something in his backpack before continuing down the street. Diane's heart began to beat faster. Hadn't there been reports of break-ins in the next county over? Something about thieves casing houses first, taking pictures to plan their entry points. She'd read about it in the community newsletter just last week. The boy stopped again, this time looking at his phone as if checking an address. That sealed it for Diane. Without hesitation, she grabbed her cordless phone from the side table and dialed the number she had memorized years ago. "Hello, police." "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in the Oakwood neighborhood," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd cultivated as watch coordinator. "A young male, African-American, maybe 12 years old, walking up and down Maple Street. He's taking pictures of houses and carrying a large backpack. I've never seen him before, and he's been looking at homes very carefully." The dispatcher asked for more details, which Diane provided with precision. The boy's location, direction of travel, what he was wearing. She felt a flush of pride at her attentiveness to detail. "No, he hasn't done anything explicitly threatening," she admitted when asked directly. "But in this neighborhood, we notice things that don't belong. Better safe than sorry, right?" As she hung up, Diane felt that familiar satisfaction of doing her civic duty. She returned to the window, keeping the boy in sight while she waited for the police to arrive. Mrs. Peterson from across the street had noticed her watching and came to her own window, raising her eyebrows in silent question. Diane nodded meaningfully and pointed discreetly at the boy. Within minutes, several curtains on the street had been pulled aside, various neighbors now monitoring the situation. The boy seemed oblivious to the attention, still walking slowly, still stopping to look at houses. He checked his watch, then his phone, appearing to be waiting for something or someone. When the first police car turned onto Maple Street, Diane felt a surge of relief. The system worked. The community was protected. She watched as the patrol car slowed near the boy, lights flashing but no siren. A second police car appeared from the opposite end of the street. Diane stepped onto her porch for a better view as the officers approached the boy. From this distance, she couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the boy's body language change. His shoulders tensing, his hands raised slightly in a universal gesture of harmlessness. Something about his posture, frightened, confused, made the first tiny seed of doubt plant itself in Diane's mind. But she pushed it away. The police would sort everything out. If the boy had a legitimate reason to be here, he could simply explain himself. Then a black SUV with government plates turned onto the street and everything changed. That morning had started like something from a dream for Anthony. The 12-year-old had barely slept the night before, too excited about the regional science competition where his renewable energy project would be judged. His mom had helped him load his carefully constructed solar panel array into the car, making sure nothing would break during the drive. "Remember to breathe when you're explaining your project," his mom had told him, adjusting his collar before they entered the community center. She worked as chief of staff for the governor, but today she was just a proud mom, her usual professional demeanor softened by obvious pride. Anthony's hands had trembled slightly as he set up his display. Months of research, design, and testing had led to this moment. He'd stayed up late so many nights, reading everything he could find about renewable energy, determined to create something that could make a real difference. When the judges came by, 3 serious-looking adults with clipboards, Anthony took a deep breath just like his mom said and launched into his explanation. The words flowed easily once he started. This wasn't just a school project to him, it was his passion. The angle of the panels maximizes energy collection while the storage system I designed allows for power during cloudy periods, he explained, pointing to his diagrams. One judge had raised her eyebrows, clearly impressed by his thorough understanding. The announcement of winners had been delayed, making his stomach twist with nerves. When they finally called his name for first place, Anthony had frozen for a second, not quite believing it. The metal felt heavy against his chest as the governor herself, his mom's boss, shook his hand and praised his work. She'd even mentioned something about a bright future in environmental science. "Your mom has told me all about your project, but seeing it in person is even more impressive," the governor had said, her handshake firm but friendly. After the ceremony, his mom had hugged him tightly. "I've got to head back to the office for a few hours," she said apologetically. "But David's mom said you can go over to their house to celebrate. I'll pick you up at 6. David had been Anthony's best friend since 3rd grade. His family had moved to Oakwood last year, and though they didn't see each other as often now, they still worked on science projects together whenever possible. David had texted that morning to congratulate him, already having heard about the win from his mom, who had attended as a volunteer. The drive to Oakwood had been filled with his mom's proud chatter. "The governor was genuinely impressed," she kept saying. "That could turn into an internship someday if you're interested." When they pulled up to David's street, Anthony checked the address again. "Looks like they're not home yet," his mom said, noticing the empty driveway. David's text said they'd be back from the store in 20 minutes. "Do you want me to wait with you?" "Mom, I'm 12, not 5, Anthony had replied with the exasperated confidence of a preteen. "I'll just walk around and look at the houses while I wait. I need pictures for my architecture assignment anyway." His mom had hesitated before nodding. "Okay, but stay on this street and answer your phone if I call." With a final congratulatory squeeze of his shoulder, she'd driven off to her meeting. Anthony had been too excited to just sit on the porch. David had mentioned that Oakwood had some of the oldest houses in the city, perfect for his architecture project. His history teacher would be impressed if he included some real examples of Victorian and colonial styles. With his medal tucked safely in his backpack next to his camera, Anthony began strolling down the street, admiring the beautiful homes. He took photos of interesting architectural details, a carved gable here, a unique window frame there. He checked his watch occasionally, knowing David would be back soon. The neighborhood was peaceful and surprisingly quiet for a Saturday afternoon. Anthony paused to inspect his map again, making sure he hadn't wandered too far from David's house. He was calculating how many more photos he needed when he noticed the police car turning onto the street. At first he didn't think much of it, just a patrol car driving by. But then it slowed near him, lights beginning to flash. Anthony felt a sudden chill despite the warm day. His parents had had the talk with him last year about how to behave if approached by police. Stay calm, be respectful, make no sudden movements. When the second police car appeared, blocking the other end of the street, Anthony's heart began to pound in his chest. What was happening? What had he done wrong? The police cars came to a stop, one in front of Anthony and one behind him. He stood frozen on the sidewalk, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. The metal in his backpack suddenly felt heavy, like it was weighing him down. 2 officers stepped out of the first car. One was tall with broad shoulders, his uniform crisp, and his face set in a stern expression. The name tag on his chest read Officer Wilson. The second officer was shorter with salt and pepper hair. Her tag said Officer Mendez. They'd approached slowly, hands resting near their belts but not on their weapons. "Afternoon, young man," Officer Wilson said, his voice neither friendly nor hostile. "Mind if we ask what you're doing in this neighborhood?" Anthony swallowed hard, remembering his father's words. Be polite, be clear, keep your hands where they can see them. His father had practiced these situations with him, role-playing until the responses became second nature. Still, knowing what to do and actually doing it with real police officers standing in front of you were two very different things. I'm waiting for my friend, Anthony said, his voice coming out smaller than he intended. He lives on this street. I'm supposed to meet him at his house. Officer Mendez took a small step forward. What's your friend's name and address? David Chen. He lives at 1842 Maple Street. His family moved here last year. Anthony could feel his palms getting sweaty. I was just taking pictures of the houses while I waited. For my school project. Taking pictures, huh? Officer Wilson's eyebrows raised slightly. Mind showing us your backpack? Anthony hesitated. The backpack contained nothing but his science medal, his camera, a water bottle, and some snacks his mom had packed. But something in his gut told him to be careful. It's just my camera and some stuff from the science competition today, he explained. I'm won first place. Officer Wilson didn't look impressed. That's nice, but we've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Someone taking pictures of houses could be casing them for a break-in. A cold feeling spread through Anthony's chest. Someone had reported him for taking pictures for a school project. I can call David's parents, Anthony offered, slowly reaching toward his pocket. They can tell you. Hold it, Officer Wilson said sharply, his hand moving to his belt. Keep your hands where I can see them. Anthony froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. His throat felt tight, making it hard to swallow. He carefully raised both hands to chest level, palms forward. I was just going to get my phone, he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer Mendez's expression softened slightly. We need to be careful, understand? Just tell us where your phone is, and I'll get it for you. Front right pocket, Anthony said. As Officer Mendez stepped forward, Anthony noticed more people had come outside. Faces peered from windows and porches along the street. A woman with crossed arms stood watching from her front yard, her expression a mixture of concern and suspicion. Officer Mendez carefully removed the phone from Anthony's pocket. What's the passcode? 1 to 50 to 3, Anthony said, thinking of his birthday, May 15th. As Officer Mendez unlocked the phone, Anthony noticed the second police car's door opening. Another officer stepped out, watching the scene carefully. Who should we call to verify your story? Officer Wilson asked, his tone making it clear he wasn't entirely convinced. Anthony thought quickly. David's family probably wasn't home yet. His mom was in a meeting. His dad was at work across town. My mom is chief of staff for Governor Mitchell, he said, the words tumbling out before he could think better of them. She dropped me off here on her way to a meeting. You can call her office. The officers exchanged glances. Officer Wilson's expression shifted to one of slight skepticism. That's quite a claim, young man, he said, his tone suggesting he thought Anthony was making things up to avoid trouble. Officer Mendez scrolled through Anthony's phone. I don't see any contact for the governor's office. Do you have your mother's number? Anthony nodded, feeling a mix of frustration and fear. Why didn't they believe him? It's under Mom in my contacts. As Officer Mendez found the number and prepared to dial, the tension in the air was suddenly broken by the sound of a vehicle with a powerful engine turning onto the street. All heads turned to see a black government SUV with tinted windows approaching the scene. The vehicle slowed as it neared them, and even the officers seemed surprised by its appearance. The rear window lowered, revealing a face that made Officer Wilson straighten his posture immediately. Anthony felt a rush of relief as he recognized the passenger. Maybe now someone would listen to him. The black SUV came to a smooth stop alongside the police cars. Two men in dark suits exited first, scanning the area with practiced efficiency. They stood with straight backs and alert eyes, clearly security personnel. The neighborhood had gone eerily quiet, with only the distant sound of a lawnmower breaking the silence. Then the rear door opened and Governor Mitchell stepped out. She was dressed in a navy blue pantsuit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. Even without the trappings of her office, she carried an unmistakable air of authority. The confused expressions on the officers' faces might have been comical in any other situation. Anthony? The governor called, her brow furrowed with concern as she approached. What's going on here? Officer Wilson straightened his uniform and cleared his throat. Governor Mitchell, we were responding to a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. This young man was taking photographs of historical architecture for a school project. The governor finished for him, her tone measured but firm. She turned to Anthony with a warm smile. How are you doing? Your mother mentioned dropping you at a friend's house after the competition. Anthony's shoulders relaxed slightly for the first time since the police had arrived. I'm okay, ma'am. David's family isn't home yet, so I was just waiting and taking pictures for my history class. The governor nodded, then turned back to the officers. Her expression remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath the smile. Officers, this young man is Anthony Johnson. His mother, Dr. Lisa Johnson, is my chief of staff. I personally presented Anthony with a first-place medal at the regional science competition this morning. Officer Mendez had the grace to look embarrassed. We were simply responding to a call. Governor, standard procedure. I understand, Governor Mitchell replied. And whose call were you responding to? The officers exchanged glances. Officer Wilson gestured subtly toward the woman standing on her porch across the street, Diane Reynolds, who was now frozen in place, her coffee mug still clutched in her hand. The governor followed his gaze. I see. By now, nearly every resident on the street had emerged from their homes. Some pretended to check their mail or water plants, but all were watching the scene unfold. Phones were out, recording. What had started as one woman's suspicion had become a neighborhood spectacle. Governor Mitchell placed a gentle hand on Anthony's shoulder. May I see what you've been working on? Anthony nodded, carefully removing his camera from his backpack. As he showed her the photos he'd taken, explaining his project on architectural styles, the governor listened with genuine interest. These are excellent, she said, loud enough for others to hear. You have a good eye for detail. The comparison between Victorian and colonial features is particularly well observed. From her porch, Diane Reynolds watched the interaction, her face growing paler by the second. When the governor turned and began walking directly toward her house, Diane looked like she might retreat inside. But she remained frozen in place as the governor approached, Anthony and the officers following behind. Good afternoon, Governor Mitchell said pleasantly. I believe you're the person who called the police. Diane clutched her mug tighter. Yes. I'm the Neighborhood Watch Coordinator. We've had some concerns about break-ins recently, and when I saw someone unfamiliar taking photos of houses. I understand being vigilant, the governor said, her voice reasonable. Safety is important to all of us, but I'm curious, did you consider speaking to Anthony yourself before calling the police? Asking if he needed help finding an address, perhaps? Diane's gaze dropped to her feet. Several neighbors had drawn closer, no longer pretending not to listen. I wasn't. Diane stumbled over her words. A car pulled into a driveway further down the street. A family emerged, a woman, a man, and a boy about Anthony's age. Anthony, the boy called out, waving enthusiastically. Then he stopped short, taking in the police cars, the governor's SUV, and the crowd that had gathered. What's happening? Anthony waved back. Hi, David. Your mom said you'd be back soon. Realization dawned on Diane's face as she looked between Anthony and David. The pieces came together. This was David Chen's friend, waiting at his house as planned. Her assumptions suddenly seemed not just wrong, but painfully, embarrassingly misguided. The governor watched the changing expressions on Diane's face and nodded slightly, as if confirming something to herself. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, meant just for Diane. I think we should talk, she said. All of us. Diane Reynolds had imagined many scenarios when she called the police that afternoon. A troublemaker caught in the act. A thank you from neighbors for her vigilance. Maybe even a mention in the community newsletter. Never in her wildest dreams had she pictured standing on her own porch face-to-face with the governor while a dozen neighbors watched in stunned silence. Please come inside, Diane managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Her husband Tom appeared in the doorway behind her, confusion written across his face as he took in the scene, the governor, the police officers, and the gathering crowd. What's going on? He asked, looking from his wife to the unexpected visitors. There's been a misunderstanding, Diane said, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. The word misunderstanding felt woefully inadequate, but it was all she could manage. Governor Mitchell nodded politely to Tom. Your wife called the police on a young man who was simply waiting for his friend and taking photographs for a school project. That young man happens to be the son of my chief of staff. Tom's eyes widened as he looked at Anthony, who stood quietly beside the governor. The realization of what had happened, what could have happened, seemed to hit him all at once. Please, everyone come in, he said, stepping aside to make room. Officer Wilson cleared his throat. If everything's settled here, we should probably get back on patrol. The governor turned to the officers. Thank you for your professionalism. I would, however, appreciate a follow-up report on this incident. My office will be in touch. The officers nodded, their expressions carefully neutral as they returned to their vehicles. The neighbors remained, watching as the governor, Anthony, and David's family followed Diane and Tom into the house. Inside, Diane moved mechanically, offering seats and water to her unexpected guests. Her living room, usually a point of pride with its carefully arranged furniture and family photos, now felt like an interrogation room. She couldn't meet Anthony's eyes. I think, the governor said once everyone was seated, we should be direct about what happened today. Her tone was not unkind, but it left no room for evasion. Mrs. Reynolds, you saw a young black boy in your neighborhood and immediately assumed he didn't belong here. Diane flinched at the bluntness. That's not. I didn't, she began, but the defense died on her lips. Wasn't that exactly what had happened? I've lived here 15 years, she said instead, her voice small. I know all the families. I didn't recognize him. And you didn't consider approaching him yourself? Asking if he needed help? David's mother asked quietly. She sat with perfect posture, her hand resting protectively on her son's shoulder. There have been break-ins reported, Diane said weakly. The newsletter said to report suspicious activity. And what exactly was suspicious? The governor asked. The photography? The walking? Or was it something else? The silence that followed was deafening. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Anthony looked down at his hands. I made a mistake, Diane finally admitted, her voice breaking. I saw what I expected to see, not what was actually there. The governor nodded slowly. That's called bias, Mrs. Reynolds. We all have it. The question is whether we recognize it and work to overcome it. For the first time, Anthony spoke up. My dad says that being afraid isn't the problem. It's what you do with that fear that matters. All eyes turned to him. Despite everything that had happened, his voice was steady, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. My parents taught me what to do if police stop me, he continued. Keep my hands visible. Speak clearly. Don't make sudden movements. I'm 12, and I already have to think about these things. David's father leaned forward, his expression grave. Our son has the same instructions. It's a conversation black and brown parents have been having with their children for generations. Diane felt tears welling in her eyes. The weight of what she had done, what could have happened, settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. I'm sorry, she whispered, looking directly at Anthony for the first time. I am so sorry. Outside on the street, neighbors still lingered, speculation running wild. The police cars had left, but the governor's SUV remained, its presence like an exclamation mark at the end of a sentence that the whole neighborhood was now forced to read. Inside Diane's living room, something important was happening, something that felt like the painful beginning of change. The conversation in Diane's living room lasted nearly 2 hours. What began as tense confrontation gradually shifted into something more productive, difficult but necessary dialogue. Governor Mitchell, drawing on her years as a civil rights attorney before entering politics, guided the discussion with a steady hand. The hardest part of addressing bias, she explained, is acknowledging it exists in the first place. Diane sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The initial shock had worn off, leaving her with a hollow feeling in her chest. I've never thought of myself as prejudiced, she said quietly. I have colleagues of all backgrounds. I donate to good causes. Most people don't see themselves that way, David's father replied. He spoke calmly, but the strain of the day showed in the tightness around his eyes. That's what makes implicit bias so dangerous. It operates below the surface of our conscious thoughts. Tom, who had been mostly silent, finally spoke up. When we moved here 15 years ago, this neighborhood looked different. He gestured vaguely with his hands. More uniform, I guess you could say. You mean wider, David's mother said directly, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. 6 months passed. The maple trees that lined Oakwood's streets had shed their summer green, turned brilliant orange, and now stood bare against the winter sky. But inside the community center, warmth and excitement filled the air as residents gathered for what had become a monthly tradition, the Oakwood Community Forum. Diane Reynolds stood near the refreshment table, arranging cookies on a platter. She looked different somehow, not just the new hairstyle, but something in her posture, in the way she carried herself. Less rigid, more open. Need any help with that? Dr. Lisa Johnson asked, approaching with a stack of programs. I think I've got it, Diane replied with a smile. How's Anthony doing backstage? Nervous. Surprisingly calm, Lisa said. He says after facing down police cars, a little public speaking is nothing. Both women laughed, the kind of laughter that only comes after difficult truths have been acknowledged and worked through. The journey to this moment had not been easy for either of them. The first meeting between Diane and Anthony's parents had been tense, raw with emotion. Dr. Elijah Johnson, Anthony's father, had spoken quietly but directly about the fear he felt when his son told him what happened. Lisa had been less restrained, her anger giving voice to generations of similar incidents. Diane had listened, truly listened, perhaps for the first time in her life. 5 minutes until we start, Tom called out, passing by with a clipboard. His role as the forum's timekeeper suited him, steady, reliable, making sure everyone had their say. The community center was filling up quickly. David and Anthony sat in the front row, heads bent over a tablet, making last-minute adjustments to their presentation. Nearby, Officer Mendez chatted with David's parents, discussing recent changes to police training procedures. The Neighborhood Watch Group, now rebranded as the Community Connection Committee, had set up a table displaying their new mission statement and initiatives. At precisely 7 o'clock, Governor Mitchell took the stage. Though no longer required to attend these meetings, she had made it a point to support what she called a model for community healing. 6 months ago, she began, an incident in this neighborhood could have ended very differently. Instead, it became the catalyst for remarkable change. She gestured toward the diverse crowd. What happened here in Oakwood isn't just about one misunderstanding. It's about what communities can accomplish when they confront uncomfortable truths and commit to doing better. Diane felt a lump in her throat as she remembered that day, the shame, the defensiveness, and then the painful process of examining her own biases. She had lost friends over the past months, neighbors who preferred comfortable silence to difficult conversations. But she had gained so much more. The governor continued, tonight's presentations from our youth leadership program show how the next generation is helping us build a more inclusive community. First up, please welcome Anthony Johnson and David Chen with their project on building bridges, both literal and metaphorical. The audience applauded as the boys took the stage. Their science project had evolved into something bigger. A community initiative that paired young people from different neighborhoods for collaborative projects. What began as a response to division had become a model other communities were beginning to adopt. As Anthony began speaking, Diane caught Lisa's eye across the room. Both women smiled, acknowledging without words how far they'd come. The monthly forums had expanded beyond Oakwood to include neighboring communities. The police department had implemented new training programs. The school district had revised its curriculum to include more diverse perspectives. Small changes, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but meaningful ones. After the presentations, as people mingled and chatted, Diane found herself standing next to Anthony at the refreshment table. Great job up there, she said, genuinely impressed by his poise. Thanks, he replied, reaching for a cookie. David and I are thinking of entering the state competition with our bridge design. You'll win, Diane said confidently. Anthony grinned. Maybe. But that's not really the point, is it? Diane nodded, understanding. The journey mattered more than the destination. The connections formed, the lessons learned, the growth that came from facing difficult truths, these were the true measures of success. Outside, snow had begun to fall gently on Oakwood's streets, covering everything in a clean white blanket. Inside, a community continued the harder, more rewarding work of building something new together, not perfect, not finished, but headed in the right direction. One conversation, one change, one day at a time.